Today's video is all about underrated watches. The term underrated is pretty overused and I'm guilty of using it all the time here on my channel. But the watches we're going to talk about today are brands that are basically overlooked. They are rated what they are rated because that's what people rate them. They aren't popular for many different reasons, and I could name some of those reasons throughout this video. But in my opinion, these are watches that maybe deserve more attention because they offer really good quality or style for the price. So I consider them underrated. You may not consider them underrated. Maybe you consider them rated exactly as they should be. But I have a large list of brands to go through, around 15 different watch brands, maybe even more than that. So let's get right into the list of underrated watch brands. The first two brands I want to start with are Mido and Longines. Both under the Swatch Group, both make very high quality watches. I would say Longines makes slightly higher end watches versus Mido, but I think both brands make very, very nice watches. Mido, I love all the watches that they currently produce. My real favorites though would have to be their Heritage Divers. I love their GMTs. You're getting a movement inside there, which is a Powermatic 80 GMT, which is a true GMT. Obviously not something that you can get outside of the Etta group currently, which I like. And then of course, they also make some world timers and decompression timers. A lot of watches to choose from, and all of them at really good prices. And I always think that their quality is top notch. Longines, I think on the gray market, are an exceptional value, especially their dive watches and their GMTs. They also make some great chronographs. I've owned a number of them. The current watch that I own out of these two brands is a Mido. That is a decompression world timer GMT. It's a dive watch. It does pretty much everything. It's a very busy watch, but at the same time, I love the aesthetic, and it's a callback to a historical model. Both of these brands have a very long history, and I think that they are generally underrated. Today's video is brought to you by Chronograbs. If you guys are sick of paying high fees when buying and selling on places like eBay and Chrono24, check out chronograbs.com, where currently there are absolutely no fees buying or selling. That means you get a better price when you are buying and getting a better price when you are selling. So definitely check out chronograbs.com, an enthusiast-based marketplace started by John P. of the John P. YouTube channel, and currently the only marketplace that offers no fees. Definitely check them out at chronograbs.com. Another brand that's really good on the gray market is Montblanc, and I think that their watches, specifically the Minerva-inspired watches, are incredibly underrated. Now, you may or may not know that Minerva is under the belt of Richemont, and Richemont gave it to Montblanc. Montblanc use a lot of their designs in their heritage. They have a whole entire line dedicated to Minerva, and they make some high-end chronographs that are very, very expensive, in the $30,000 range, but they also make less expensive watches that look very similar to those very expensive watches. However, they use Sellita-based movements, and they are awesome, awesome watches, and they look fantastic. I love Minerva chronographs, and I love the Minerva designs, the Minerva-inspired designs that Montblanc are using. And on the secondary market, like I mentioned, excellent value. And I own one of them. I own a GMT with a copper dial that I think is gorgeous, and I'll throw up video of that watch so you can see what I'm talking about. The next brand on this list is Vulcain, a historic watch brand that has some iconic watches in its arsenal. They have been coming out with reissues of all of their iconic watches, including their Cricket, which is a watch that has been worn by presidents. In fact, there are a number of presidents that wear Vulcain, and that's where they get their nickname, the President's Watch. The Cricket is an alarm watch, but they also make a Nautic skin diver, which is probably my favorite watch that they currently make, mainly because I think it's just a great looking watch, and the bracelet on this watch is like no other bracelet that you can get from any other brand. They also make a chronograph version, which is extremely good looking. I think that their watches are historic, good looking and extremely well made. They use ETA movements, they don't use Sellita movements, and you can definitely see that they care about their design and the overall aesthetic of their watches. Titoni is another brand that I've never really spoken about here on my channel, and I think they are very underrated. I don't think anybody is really talking about this brand. They are also a heritage brand. They are an independent brand. They're family owned, made in Switzerland. They've been around since 1919. They have their own in-house movements, although not all of their watches feature in-house movements. One of my favorite watches that they make is the C-Scoper. This is a really high quality dive watch that gets all the bells and whistles on the fly micro adjust and in-house movement. It's, I think, 300 meters or 500 meters of water resistance, ceramic bezel. It gets a lot of specs, and it's also a heritage design, and they don't cost all that money considering all the watch that you are getting. I think they're a very underrated brand, especially again if you go on that gray market, but even at retail, these are fantastic watches. Next brand on this list is Nivada Grenchen. They've been around for a very long time. They're a very historic brand as well. They were the first brand to come out with a 1,000-meter dive watch. That is their Depth Master, a watch that they've recently reissued, and they have made plenty of different versions of this watch. A really small watch, actually. It's not a very large dive watch, and it gets 1,000 meters of water resistance. Extremely wearable, probably one of the most wearable dive watches that gets 1,000 meters of water resistance. But that's not their only iconic watch. There is also the Chronomaster. They make the Antarctic. They make a lot of iconic watches, and they are often overlooked. When you look around at all these different websites like Hodinkee and Worn & Wound, you don't see too much about Nivada Grenchen, although they are making some fantastic watches. You can see a theme here in this video. A lot of the brands that we're talking about have a very long and storied history. Jaquet Droz is yet another brand with a very long and storied history, and they make some pretty incredible watches. Now, specifically on the secondary market is where I would go for Jaquet Droz, because they are extremely underrated on the secondary market. They are very expensive watches, but they are an historic brand. They started out making highly complicated clocks that included automation. So there were little figures that moved. They still do this with some of their watches. They made a bird automation that was really cool. I got hands-on with that watch a while ago. The bird actually chirps and moves around. It's a combination between a minute repeater and just a work of art. These are very expensive watches, like I said, at retail, but if you go to the secondary market for their standard models, obviously nothing with an automation in it, those watches sell for fantastic prices. They are owned by the Swatch Group, and they get Frédéric Piget movements inside, so basically Blancpain movements inside, because Blancpain uses all Frédéric Piget movements. So they share these movements, and essentially what you are getting is a very high-end movement in a very high-end watch, and if you get them on the secondary market, you're paying about 70% off. They are very elegant as well. They're famous for their grand seconds, so a lot of their watches look very distinct because you have this very large second hand offset on the dial, and then the time telling portion is just a small dial at the top, giving you almost an 8 on the dial. Very interesting watches, very distinct looking, and very, very high quality, especially if you go and buy them on the secondary market. They are an incredible value. I've made a dedicated video about the next brand because I feel so strongly about their neo vintage watches. I'm talking about Ebel. Ebel, if you are interested in their history and you want to know more about their watches, I will put a link to a video that I did basically explaining most of their history and a lot about their watches that offer really good value. That's because they use higher end movements, or at least their neo vintage watches used very high end movements. They also had jewelry like bracelets. The bracelets on these watches were very, very high quality. They are very distinct looking, and you will immediately know that it's an Ebel when you're looking at one. The movements that they used were movements like the El Primero, high-end movements like La Magna chronographs, and they've used a number of other movements as well, like Frédéric Piget. So they are using very high-end movements in their watches, or used very high-end movements in their watches, because currently today they don't. these are underrated watches if you go to the secondary market and buy these used or new on the gray market. Two more brands that I want to group together here is Angelus and Arnold and Son, both owned by the Citizen Group. However, these are the haute horology division of Citizen. These are their highest end watches. They are made by Girard-Perregaux, so these get their bespoke movements made by Girard-Perregaux. Arnold and Son, a little bit more classically designed, using some really classic complications like stop seconds, and they also make a stop seconds chronograph. They make tourbillons, they make 3D moon phases, so very high-end watchmaking happening at Arnold and Son. And then Angelus, kind of sporty or a little bit more on the sportier side, also making some very high-end chronographs and of course tourbillons. I actually own one of their tourbillons. That is the U50, which is a diving tourbillon with 300 meters of water resistance in grade 5 titanium. All of these watches, again, I think underrated, and especially on the secondary market, these are a bargain because they do sell for very, very good prices considering what you're actually getting. These are haute horology watches that sell for an excellent price. IWC, if you watch this channel, you know I love IWC. I don't love their current watches and the pricing that they are charging right now. I do like them, but I think they are very expensive, and I think they might be a little bit overrated in certain circumstances because some of them are going for way too much money. But if we're talking about their vintage watches or neo-vintage watches like the Ingenieur, I think they are an incredible bargain. Their Pilot's watches, the Big Pilot, they are fantastic on the secondary market. I think the most underrated version of IWC that you can buy right now is one of their vintage or neo-vintage perpetual calendars. I've owned a few. I actually own two. One was a GST. Those sell for around $6,000 to $10,000, and you are getting a chronograph that is a perpetual calendar with a moon phase. And then I also own an Ingenieur, which sells for around $14,000. That is a digital version of a perpetual calendar from IWC. It's fully mechanical. It just has a digital display. So you have a digital month and a digital day, and you also have a digital leap year. It's a flyback chronograph, 120 meters of water resistance. I mean, these watches are incredible for the price. For the price of a Rolex Submariner, you could have something that is truly unique and one of a kind, and you will never see anybody else wearing one. Fortis is another brand that I've talked about here on the channel from time to time. I think that they make really high quality watches. However, I think they are largely overlooked. They were started by an employee of Eterna. Eterna, another one of my favorite brands that I think are extremely underrated. So let's throw Eterna on the list as well. I've featured many Eterna here on my channel, and they have a very long history as well. Really high quality watches. I would only buy those on the secondary market because you can get them for a very good price. But Fortis makes some very high quality watches as well. And again, on the secondary market, even better, they make some really great tool watches. All of their watches are essentially tool watches. I think they've made some dress watches in the past, but right now I would go for their Pilot's watch or their GMT. They both get in-house movements. Technically, I know they're not all in-house, but they are proprietary to Fortis. They have a long-standing relationship with space agencies, not only outside of the United States, inside the United States as well, with NASA, astronauts, cosmonauts, including the official watch of the Russian space missions. My favorite watch is definitely the F43. It's a triple GMT. I think this is just a cool watch, and I've always wanted to own one since they came out, and that wasn't that long ago. I think they are very good looking watches, but they have a lot of watches that you could choose from. Their chronographs are awesome on the secondary market for a very good price, and they are very high quality. The next two watches I'm going to talk about are Girard-Perregaux and Chopard, LUC, specifically LUC because the LUC means that they are a higher version of Chopard. Chopard wanted to compete with the Holy Trinity, so they came out with LUC. LUC do not sell well on the secondary market. So again, I would say go to gray market. You can get a lot of new Chopard on the secondary market. The LUCs for great prices. Girard-Perregaux make their own in-house movements. They have some iconic watches like the Laureato and their World Timer. I own their World Timer. I loved that watch. It's a chronograph. It's kind of a complicated watch. They're really well made. And of course, like I said, an icon for the brand. Chopard really don't have an icon. However, their watches are pretty amazing and very high quality. I love their micro rotor movement. These are completely underrated watches, and like I said, especially on the secondary market, you can get a lot of watch for your money if you go to the secondary market for Girard-Perregaux and Chopard. The last three brands on this list, two are independent brands, Habring and Ox & Junior. These are two brands that you definitely need to check out that are very, very underrated, and again, sell for a great price on the secondary market because they are pretty much overlooked. Ox & Junior are a brand that I've owned. I've never owned a Habring, but I've always wanted to own one. Former IWC employee. He makes his own watches, makes his own movements. I especially like their deadbeat seconds, which I think is really cool. I love that complication. Mechanical watch that looks like a quartz watch, I get it, but I think that's really cool. And then Ox & Junior has its own look. There aren't many watches out there that look like Ox & Junior. I love their aesthetic. It's very Bauhaus, very simple, and that's the whole point behind the brand. Lots of different materials that they're using. They make cases in sterling silver or titanium. I had a moon phase, which had like 10 different finishings on it. All of it is kind of done in a rough way. They finish things in a different way. So the whole idea behind the brand is a little bit strange, and I like that. But on the secondary market, both of those brands, they just don't do all that well. The last brand on the list is Tutima. I've featured Tutima on my channel in the past. Their dive watches are awesome. They're a German brand, and they are built like tanks. On the secondary market, they tank. No pun intended. And I just wanted to bring up Tutima. That's the last brand that I'll talk about here on this video. Tell me what you guys think down in the comment section below. I want to hear from you guys. There are a lot of other brands that I could add to this list, but I really wanted to be a little bit strict. I kept this to mostly major brands, except for the two independent brands that I mentioned. These were pretty much all major brands. I didn't want to put any micro brands on this list. I could do a completely separate list just listing some micro brands. Tell me what you think down in the comments below. Tell me what you would add to this list down in the comments below. I want to hear from you guys. Please also don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that bell icon. It is super helpful for the channel, and I very much appreciate it. Anyway, guys, thank you for logging on. Thank you for watching this video. I will catch you guys in the next video.